Some days it could be hard to talk about Wesley. That's my blood, that's my cousin. Those will always be his friends, but they won't look out for him like I would look out for him.
The firefighters are there thinking they're gonna put out just a brush fire, but the closer they get to it, they start smelling the distinct odor of flesh.
We're thinking betrayal, we're thinking finances. I mean, everything from a business deal that goes bad and there's a lot of money involved.
If you can't trust your boys, who can you trust?
This is a textbook case of a revenge murder. They wanted payback. Stephen Akins and a friend, Abdul, went to the house of his cousin, Wesley Person. All the guys had went shopping earlier that day, and they had agreed that they would meet up later on to go hang out, get some drinks.
Abdul and I show up to Wesley's place around 6, 7 o'clock in the evening. We knocked on the door, he wasn't there.
Stephen tries calling Wesley, but his cousin doesn't answer.
So we just left and went our ways.
2 more hours pass.
Abdul and I trying to really figure out, because I was sitting there like, man, it's been too long now. I know he would have texted me and said, yo, cuzzo, I'm good, I'm all right, come pick me up or whatever. I knew he would have called me, but there wasn't. So that's around that time I started being concerned. What's going on?
Later that evening, they get a call from Wesley's live-in girlfriend, Keisha Walker. She just got to the house, and Wesley's not there.
She called us and told us, hey, his bags is here. So he was here, but I don't know when he came in, because I never got a phone call from him when he came back. But all of his bags is here, even the stuff that he bought me. We called around, asking everybody that, we could have known.
They reach out to Wesley's best friend, Justin Glover, who had given Wesley a ride home from shopping that afternoon.
Justin says, I haven't seen him either. It's just not like Wesley to go off the grid like that. And as every minute passes, the group gets more and more worried. He hasn't called his cousins, he hasn't called his friends. It's a big question as to where is this man?
Wesley Person was born in Brooklyn, New York. He and his siblings were raised by his father. His dad was a strict kind of guy, a man's man, but he was loving.
Wesley had a brother and a sister, and as far as his mom goes, the family they just don't talk about her much.
Wesley's family had strong family roots in New York. He was especially close to his cousin, Stephen Akins.
We did a lot of things together as a family. Wesley was my older cousin. He was about maybe 4 years or 3 years older than I was. So even though he was my big cousin, we both played that part of making sure that we looked out for each other. He had a great imagination and he loved a lot. He loved to see smiles on people's face, and he was a jokester.
Wesley was very quick-witted and he was very protective, and that made him very popular among his friend group in high school.
Wesley's best friends outside of the family were 2 guys he grew up with in the neighborhood, Abdul Macaulay and Justin Glover.
Those 3 were close childhood friends. I'm talking elementary school, staying in each other's rooms, sleepovers, bunk bed talk, all of that good stuff.
Now, this is a tight group of guys. They did things together. They knew each other's families.
If you ever saw one of them, you saw all of them. They just stuck together in a pack.
In 2000, Wesley's crew decided to move from Brooklyn to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Lower cost of living, better job opportunities, and since these guys often made big decisions together, this was no different.
But there was only one person missing from the group, and that's the cousin. Stephen. Now, Stephen is like a brother to Wesley, so he wants his brother with him in Harrisburg.
Wesley ended up calling me and asking me, hey, there's a lot of opportunity here for you. And for real, I'm here by myself. I got my friends, but they nothing like actual blood family. So I took him on the offer. All right, I'm not doing nothing where I am, so why not come down there and hang out with you?
Fast forward 5 years, Wesley is settled in Harrisburg. He's comfortable, he likes his neighborhood, he's meeting new people.
He's putting down roots, he's making new friends, and one day when he was out on a walk, he met a girl named Keisha Walker.
Keisha was a nice person, very outgoing.
They got to know each other, and before you know it, they fell deeply in love. It only took a couple months before they moved in together.
Keisha Walker was accepted as another member of the group. They all planned a trip to New York together for the 2005 Christmas season.
Wesley wanted to take Keisha home to meet the family, and it was going to be a big road trip with the whole group. The Brooklyn friends are going back home to Brooklyn.
Our plan was to go to New York for Christmas, just to be able to hang out with the family, probably go watch the ball drop, and just that's home for us. And none of that took place.
Because the day before the group was supposed to leave, Wesley has suddenly disappeared. After another 24 hours pass with no sign of Wesley, his loved ones begin to fear the worst. But no one could imagine the events that would soon unfold.
It's now Christmas Eve. It's about 1:30 in the morning, and there's a brush fire that is brewing off of I-83 in Baltimore County. It's about 70 miles south of Harrisburg. A volunteer Baltimore County firefighter, he spots this and calls it in. Baltimore County firefighters arrived there and looked down the ravine, and from that vantage point, it looked like a brush fire. But once they got closer to the smoke and the flames, they realized it was definitely not a brush fire.
They realize it's a body.
They immediately notify police.
When I arrived, firefighters were still blocking the road. The fire had been extinguished, and the body is located on this steep embankment that goes down to the riverbed, and it's in this culvert. It was a treacherous walk from the roadside down to where the body was. At this burn site, we have a tarp, construction tarp. You can smell burning of the flesh, burning of the hair. It's a very nauseating aroma that comes about. We can also begin to smell the strong odor of an accelerant, much like kerosene. And so when we get there, we realize that we have somebody who's been rolled up in a tarp and burned.
This body was freshly placed there as opposed to have been there for a few days. And then it was pretty apparent that the body had been drugged to that location.
Given the steepness of the grade, it was obvious that 2 or more people had to be involved to carry this body from the roadside over the guardrail and down this slick slope without sliding into the river themselves.
When authorities open the tarp, they see the victim's face is so severely damaged that an identification is impossible.
We could not determine if it was a male or female at that point. Some of my immediate thoughts when I'm evaluating the scene is that maybe this is a young person who overdosed at a party and kids were looking for a place to dump them, and then thinking, if we set it on fire, it'll burn it and nobody will ever know. That was a thing that happened in that time. Kids would have parties at their parents' house without the parents knowing. Somebody would die, and then they would dispose of the body.
Then, detectives notice fabric on the victim's wrists.
When we see that the wrists are actually bound, then we begin to think that there's something more foul had actually happened here.
family and friends of Wesley Person are searching for him in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Detectives 70 miles south in Baltimore County continue investigating a burned body found off Interstate 83.
We began to look closer at the body. And it's at this point that we begin seeing exit wounds from the victim's face. So we roll the body over and we can now see entrance wounds from gunshots close up at the back of the head. So immediately, we all look at each other and realize we have an execution. When we had rolled the body over to be examined the back of the victim's head, we find this debris. Things that you would see from a construction site.
We saw tidbits of what we thought was drywall turned out to be plaster. We saw sawdust and I think it was even like drywall screws.
We now see a can that's in between the victim's legs. And the top is cut off and it's charred beyond belief. But it itself actually had that strong aroma of the accelerant that we had been smelling earlier while on the scene. Crime Lab comes in and they put some lights on the scene for us, and we're able to then begin looking around the scene. So we're looking for footprints in the snow. We're looking for anything that may have been discarded that could be related to it. And as we're looking around, we find what looks to be a freshly discarded cigarette lighter.
Investigators collect the evidence, and the medical examiner removes the body.
We get into the autopsy room, and as a homicide detective at that time, it was a common practice that the detective actually works alongside with the actual medical examiner during the autopsy process. We can now see that we have an African-American male who is light-skinned in color and even has a piece of jewelry, an earring, in his left earlobe.
The victim was not just burned, they were shot multiple times to the back of the head, exiting out the front, which makes it really hard to get a dental ID.
Then the next step we look at is fingerprints. So when we started to examine his hands, we could see that the ends of his fingers were burned off. They were burned down to the bone, with the exception of a couple of those digits. And on those exceptions, we found just a few slivers of skin that still maintained part of the fingerprint.
But the damage is severe, and they only ink a partial print, not enough to run through the database.
The last way that we can identify a victim, in this case, is through DNA. And so we take blood samples and other samples for toxicology and for DNA profiling that we hope to do later in the investigation.
Unfortunately, the DNA sample will help only if the victim's DNA is already in the system, or if detectives find someone to compare it to.
As we're working through this, we become perplexed with how are we going to identify this victim so that we can get more information about their background. And so I realized that as a sketch artist, I can take pictures of the victim here in the autopsy room and then later conduct a post-mortem sketch and then release that to the media in hopes that we can make an identification.
And Ken Lang was also a forensic sketch artist. And so he had done a rendering of the victim, drawing of his face, some very distinct features, such as his hairstyle, his cornrows, and there was a pretty distinct earring.
Investigators decide not to include the earring in the sketch that will be released to the public.
This would be some intimate information that only we as detectives know about this victim.
Once the sketch is completed, they were able to share it with law enforcement agencies and news organizations across the I-83 corridor. They shared it from DC, York, Pennsylvania, all the way up to Harrisburg.
We don't normally release beyond the Baltimore metro area, but we did. Knowing that we were on that I-83 corridor, we wanted to expand that search.
2 days later, they get a call from Harrisburg. That caller was Keisha Walker. She said that sketch looked like her boyfriend, Wesley Person. Only one thing. She said it didn't have the earring in his ear.
As soon as we had this information, we knew that this was probably going to be our victim, Wesley Person.
When Keisha Walker tells Baltimore police she thinks the body they found is her boyfriend, Wesley Person, Baltimore PD reaches out to their counterparts in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. A set of prints they have from a 2001 marijuana charge matches the partial print from the body. It's Wesley.
Ken and I immediately jumped in the car and headed off to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to talk to the caller.
And we end up at Wesley Person's house in Steelton, PA. And when we do, we're met with an entourage of friends.
At this point, the entire Brooklyn crew is sitting in Keisha's house. Abdul McCulley, Stephen Akins, Justin Glover, all the people who last saw Wesley alive on that day.
When we make the death notification, obviously everybody begins to cry and sob. But one person in particular, Justin Glover, becomes extremely upset at this news. Insomuch that he storms out the back of the house into the backyard and is flailing and screaming. He was really upset. So we asked him for a name and a phone number that we could put down in a report so maybe we can contact him later when he was a little bit more able to speak.
After Justin leaves, detectives begin their interviews with Wesley's girlfriend, Keisha.
They ask her, when was the last time you saw Wesley alive? And she says that it was a couple days before Christmas when he went shopping with his cousin and his friend.
According to Keisha, everything seemed normal that day. As she left for work, she saw Stephen and Abdul drive up to take Wesley to the mall for some Christmas shopping. When Keisha got home from work, she knew Wesley had returned, briefly.
She said the shopping bags were there, but Wesley was not.
After 4 days, she reported Wesley missing to police. The next day, she saw the sketch on the news. Detectives' next interview is with Wesley's cousin, Stephen, who provides more details about their trip to the mall and the cash Wesley was spending.
We stopped at a few places to get clothes and shoes. Myself, Wesley, and Abdul. And the whole time I was really curious because I know that he didn't really have, a lot of money. And with that, it made me curious, like, where is, all of this money coming from? I received a phone call from Justin, and he asked where we were, and I didn't think nothing of it. He's a part of our group. So I told him, yeah, we at Sneaker Villa.
Stephen says that as they were leaving, Justin showed up in the parking lot with another friend named Lawrence Morrell.
Wesley put his clothes in the trunk. I put my bags in the trunk. After doing that, I opened up the back door and I sat inside the vehicle. They were a little distance away from where we were parked at, but there were a lot of frustrating talk, hand gestures, but I couldn't really understand what they were saying. But just looking at the lips move and the hand gestures moving, I felt that it was an angry conversation. Wesley walked back over to the car and he ended up telling me that he's gonna ride with Justin. He grabbed his bags out the trunk and he gave me some money. He told me he would get with me later on back at the house. We drove off, and I even said that to Abdul, like, man, something don't feel right. Like, I felt the energy. And that was the last time I seen him. The last time.
When police speak to Abdul, he adds a troubling detail about some dangerous activity he thinks Wesley was involved in.
He tells him about a possible scam involving a local credit union.
They would take and find a young lady who has no credit, have her make an application for a car loan that was tied into a used car lot that they had a relationship with. They would inflate the value of the car. The young lady would take the application to the bank. The bank that didn't have any procedures or policies for collecting collateral and was just issuing out these loans would then issue out the loan for this inflated price of a car. They would then issue the loan out in a series of checks, and the group would go and cash these checks.
Abdul claims that Justin, Lawrence, and Wesley would set up the scam, connect the players, and distribute the cash when it was done.
Now, it was much like a pyramid scheme. So, if the further down in the pyramid you were, for each person that was a level up for you, every time you've done this transaction, you needed to pay each of these people $1,000 from the proceeds that you received.
Their plan worked perfectly until something changed one day.
Abdul Macaulay tells us Wesley had just did such a transaction with a young lady, but never paid anybody any money. So at this juncture of the investigation, we begin to see a motive. In this case, obviously, somebody was looking for revenge.
Investigating the murder of Wesley Person, detectives can't get a hold of Wesley's best friend, Justin Glover, who also seems to be avoiding his friends.
We didn't hear from him. He didn't come around us.
But his friends tell police what Justin told them before Wesley's body was found.
Justin said that after they took him home and dropped him off after he got his bags out of the vehicle, Justin and Lawrence, I'm assuming Lawrence was with him, that they left and left him in the house.
Lawrence also seems to be avoiding detectives, but they have plenty of other leads to follow up on, including Abdul's story about the fraudulent car loans.
So our next stop is the credit union. And when we meet up with the investigator at the credit union, we learn a wealth of information. We learn that this banking scheme has been going on for some time.
And it was like 2 or 3 binders worth of this scheme that had been ongoing. And when she laid it out, she kind of had a high-level summary and an organizational chart of the players that were involved.
3 of the names are very familiar.
It was an arrangement with Wesley Person and Lawrence Morrell and Justin Glover to steal, to engage in this bank fraud scheme.
We also learned this was the first time Wesley did this transaction, and that he received $20,000 in all from the different checks that were cashed, and that he received it, the last payment, on December 23rd, just in time for Christmas.
A woman by the name of Karen was recruited into the scheme. She got the check, she got her cut, and Wesley pocketed the rest.
Wesley's share was nearly $20,000.
Detectives are starting to get the sense that Wesley's murder was possibly payback for him not sharing that $20,000 with the group.
If Wesley cheated Justin and Lawrence out of their cut, Their desire for revenge might have been motive for murder. To learn more about that murder, investigators turned to the evidence found with Wesley's body.
When they found the body of Wesley wrapped in that tarp, there was also like plaster and things that were associated with a construction site.
Forensic specialists determined that the material is horsehair plaster, used in the 1930s and 40s, which means Wesley was most likely killed in an older home under renovation.
Now here's where it gets interesting. It turns out that Lawrence Morrell owns 5 different properties here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
They were fixing up the houses and then renting the houses. The houses were in Morrell's name.
So then we begin looking at those properties. We begin driving by the locations, seeing which may be occupied and which may not be.
Finally, they spot one under construction that seems to fit what they're looking for.
It's a townhome, 3 stories, dated back from the early 1900s. Has this beautiful old architecture that many of those types of buildings had.
Maybe that's our crime scene.
Based on the construction materials found with Wesley Person's body, police obtain a search warrant for a property owned by suspect Lawrence Morrell that is being renovated.
There was pieces of plaster, holes in the wall. And the first thing we immediately noticed is that the color was the same color on the top surface of the plaster pieces we found in the small of Wesley's back. So we take samples of that and we secure that so we can send that off for a trace analysis. There is junk and stuff galore, including rolls of tarp.
Wesley's body was rolled up in a similar tarp. When investigators search the basement, they find something even more incriminating.
In the far back corner of the basement, there's a small little cellar room with a single light bulb dangling from the ceiling. When you walk in there, the floor was still dirt. The sides of the walls were still the limestone, and you could see the rafters up above. But on the floor, plaster, wood pieces, screws.
Just like the materials found with Wesley's body.
And as I look down, I also notice a piece of round ductwork that's not quite clasped together. I saw what I thought might be blood spatter.
Authorities send the ductwork to the crime lab for further analysis. Convinced they're on the right track, detectives subpoena bank and phone records for Justin Glover and Lawrence Morrell.
They found that Justin Glover used his bank card to buy a can of Coke and some kerosene, even a lighter, things that were all found at the crime scene. They also have cell phone records that place Glover and Morrell along I-83 at the same time.
We identify some significant events that occur with Lawrence Morrell's phone and with Justin Glover's phone. Both phones are hitting off of the same tower here in Harrisburg, PA, on the same date and time, right before we believe Wesley's body was transported south into Baltimore County, Maryland. We then see that Lawrence Morrell's phone turns off. There is no signal activity going on with his phone and interacting with towers. Justin Glover's, that's a different story. His phone is actually pinging off of different towers because he's not very bright about what he's doing while he's committing the crime of moving this body across the state line. He's on his phone and he's talking to different people at different times. And that became important in this investigation because we could see and follow Justin Glover's journey south from Harrisburg through York, PA, into and across the state line of Maryland. We can then see him transporting back to Harrisburg, PA. And when they do, ironically, Lawrence Morell's phone comes back on. And when it comes on, Lawrence Morell's talking on his phone, Justin Glover's talking on his phone. Both phones are hitting the same tower down by the Capitol here in Harrisburg, PA. A lot of information is converging in this case. What we know at this point is that Justin Glover's phone puts him in the area of the crime at the time that the body was dumped.
Detectives now have enough evidence to obtain arrest warrants for Justin Glover and Lawrence Morell. When Justin finds out, he decides to turn himself in.
He and his attorney arrive at headquarters. Glover is stone drunk. He's so intoxicated, he pukes on the front sidewalk of headquarters. We take him into custody, take him upstairs, and he invokes his right to remain silent, says that he's not making any statements. But at that point, we can't ask him any questions.
Lawrence Morell is arrested shortly thereafter.
And when he's taken into custody, he also invokes his rights and asks for an attorney and declines to make any statements.
The suspects may not be talking, but test results on the blood found in Lawrence's basement tell investigators everything they need to know.
When they extracted that blood from that ductwork, and they conducted their analysis, they were able to create and define a DNA profile. And that DNA profile matches Wesley Person's DNA from the blood sample we took at the time of autopsy.
So the detective reached out to me and told me that they made an arrest on 2 different occasions for Lawrence and Justin. Part of me was like, we got them, you know, they're in custody. So now I need to know if they really did it. Are they gonna actually get it, you know, basically come out and confess it? Or are they gonna play this thing out to try to just take it to trial?
24-year-old Justin Glover and 21-year-old Lawrence Morell stand accused of murdering their childhood friend, Wesley Person, for double-crossing them in a scam involving car loans.
We were convinced that we had the right people. We looked at a long investigation, a lot of circumstantial evidence, a lot of direct evidence, and it painted a pretty coherent picture for us of what had happened in this case and who was involved and who was responsible.
The 2 men go on trial in February 2008, more than 2 years after Wesley's murder.
There's always an interesting dynamic whenever you have a jury trial, and especially a murder trial. You have victims' families, you have friends and loved ones, not only of the victim, but also of the defendant. And it creates a charged atmosphere in the courtroom.
I am angry. I'm talking about angry to the point where I wanted, like, the anger was taken so far over me that I wanted to put hands on them.
These were supposed to be some of the safest people he could be with. And now they're accused of killing him.
Prosecutors lay out the evidence for the jury, painting a picture of what they believe happened when Wesley pulled off a scam and didn't pay Justin and Lawrence.
This really harkens back to some of the simplest ideas that go in the criminal justice system. There is honor among thieves. There is a code that is understood among thieves. And that code is, we work together, we accomplish our job together, and we share in the proceeds together. And that honor among those thieves was broken. It was broken by Wesley Person when he did one theft on his own. They found out about it, and they took action to enforce the code.
According to the prosecution's theory, After Justin and Lawrence confronted Wesley at the mall, they took him back to his house where they made him hand over the money he'd stolen before getting back in the car.
I believe that the trust was still there to where they can drive around and go to different places without him feeling any issue of, I'm about to lose my life, until they probably got to that household that they were renovating.
They dragged Wesley to the basement. And shot him 3 times in the back of the head. To get rid of the evidence, they drove the body of one of their closest friends to a remote location and set it on fire.
Watching Justin Glover and Lawrence Morrell through that trial, I got no sense of remorse. I got no sense of empathy, no sense of shame for what they had done and what had happened. It was poker-faced throughout the whole proceeding.
Hopefully I could beat this. That's the look that they had, that I was getting from them anyway.
Imagine you're in court. You're seeing your friends on the witness stand, the ones now accused of killing your loved one, and thinking about you'll never see your cousin, who was more like a brother, again. If you can't trust your boys, who can you trust?
The defense argues that the state doesn't have enough evidence directly tying Justin Glover or Lawrence Morrell to the crime. But the jury doesn't seem convinced.
My recollection of the jury was they were really interested in hearing from Wesley Person's friends, the friends who testified about what they saw Wesley Person doing, particularly with Justin Glover and Lawrence Morrell in the days before he went missing.
The jury deliberates for over a day before they reach a verdict.
The jury returned a verdict of guilty for both defendants. They were found guilty of murder on February 19, 2008. The defendants were both sentenced to life in prison.
Despite the prosecution's attempt to keep both killers behind bars forever, Lawrence Morrell eventually gets out of his life sentence.
He was able to convince an appeals court that his attorney was ineffective, and he was granted the right to a new trial.
Rather than retrying him, prosecutors offered to let him plead guilty to third-degree murder.
Lawrence Morrell plea bargains and agrees to plead guilty for the time served.
And it was ultimately released.
What a tragedy this is, that this group of friends, all who set out from Brooklyn, New York, who wanted a better way of life, they come to Harrisburg, establish their roots, but then money becomes more important than their friendship.
This is a textbook case of a revenge murder. They wanted payback. You cannot mess with people's money and expect everything to work out okay. That $20,000 possibly cost Wesley his life.
Some days it could be hard to talk about Wesley, because it's basically bringing this whole.
There are crimes that horrify a community. And then there are crimes that leave something behind long after the police tape has been removed, long after the headlines disappear, long after the person responsible is locked behind concrete walls. The Clifford Olson case was one of those crimes. It began with children and teenagers disappearing from communities across British Columbia. Some were 12 years old. Some were 16. Some were older, but still young enough to be living at the fragile boundary between childhood and adulthood. They left behind bedrooms, schoolbooks, clothes, photographs, families who expected them to come home. And then, one by one, those expectations were replaced by something much harder to live with. Silence. In the lower mainland of British Columbia, the summer of 1981 became a season of fear. There was no single moment when everyone understood what was happening. There was no dramatic announcement that a serial killer was hunting children. Instead, the truth emerged slowly, painfully through fragments. A missing person report. A body discovered. Another disappearance. Another body. A name added to a growing list. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was a man who had already spent years moving through the criminal justice system. His name was Clifford Olson. He was not a stranger to crime. He had a history that included theft, violence, and sexual offenses. His past had already brought him into contact with police. Yet in 1981, investigators would begin to look at him in a very different way. Not simply as a man who had committed crimes, but as a man who might know why young people were disappearing, and perhaps, more frighteningly, where they were. The first victim in the series was 12-year-old Christine N. Weller. Her body was discovered in Richmond around Christmas time in 1980. Christmas should have been a season of warmth. Families were supposed to be gathering together. Homes were supposed to be filled with ordinary routines, familiar faces, and the anticipation of another year. Instead, somewhere in that same period, a 12-year-old girl's death became the beginning of a case that would eventually reveal 11 killings attributed to Olson. At first, no one looking at that single tragedy could have known what was coming. There would be more. In April 1981, 16-year-old Darren Todd Johnsrud disappeared. His body was later found in May. Then came more disappearances. Ada Anita Court was 13. Simon Patrick Partington was only 9. Judy Elizabeth Kozma was 14. Raymond Lawrence King was 15. Sigrun Charlotte Arndt was 18. Terry Lynn Carson was 15. Louise Marie Chartrand was 17. Sandra Wolf Steiner was 16. And there were others included in Olson's eventual confession. The ages alone tell part of the story. But numbers can become cold when repeated too many times. 9. 12. 13. 14. 15. 16. 17. 18. Those numbers are easy to read. Much harder to understand is what they represent. A child who had a favorite place to sit. A teenager whose parents knew the sound of their footsteps. Someone who had unfinished plans. Someone who expected there would be another morning. Another birthday. Another summer. Another ordinary day. The people who disappeared were not statistics when they were alive. They had voices. They had habits. They had relationships. They occupied physical spaces in other people's lives. And every disappearance left an empty space behind. By July 1981, 6 of the killings connected to Olson had occurred within a single month. 6 lives. 6 families. 6 separate tragedies converging into one horrifying pattern. For investigators, the question was becoming impossible to ignore. Was someone deliberately targeting young people? And if so, who? The answer would eventually lead back to Clifford Olson. But before police reached that answer, the killer himself would become one of the most disturbing elements of the investigation. Because Olson was not simply accused of killing. He was accused of something even more psychologically disturbing. Using the dead as leverage. Using information as currency. Using the suffering of families as a bargaining tool. And when the truth finally began to emerge, investigators would face a choice that would haunt the case for decades. How much would they be willing to give a killer in exchange for the truth? That question would become inseparable from the Clifford Olson case. Because after his arrest, Olson offered something police desperately needed. Information. He knew where the bodies were, and he was willing to tell them. But not for free. The arrangement would eventually involve 100,000 Canadian dollars being placed into a fund for his wife and children. The money was not handed directly to Olson, but the principle was devastating enough. A killer had information about dead children and teenagers. The authorities needed that information, and Olson understood exactly how much power that gave him. The public would later give the arrangement a phrase that captured the horror of it in just 3 words. Cash for bodies. It was an expression that seemed almost impossible to believe. Money. For information. About human remains. about children, about sons and daughters whose families had spent weeks or months wondering where they were. But this is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple tale of good against evil. Because police had a practical problem. They had missing people. They had suspected murders. They had families waiting for answers. And they had a suspect who claimed he could lead them to the dead. Every hour mattered. Every location mattered. Every piece of information could potentially bring a family one step closer to knowing what had happened. Yet accepting Olson's terms meant entering a relationship with a man who appeared to understand how to manipulate the people investigating him. That tension would define much of what followed. And it raises a question that still sits at the heart of the case. What would you do if the only person who could lead you to someone's child was the person you believed had killed them? Would you negotiate? Would you refuse? Would you sacrifice principle in order to recover a body? Would you allow a killer to dictate the terms because the alternative was leaving families without answers? There is no comfortable answer. And the Clifford Olson case offers no easy way out of that dilemma. But before the money, before the courtroom, before the confession, there was an investigation. And before there was an investigation, there were missing children. The first warning had already arrived months earlier. Christine Weller was 12 years old when her life ended. Her body was found in Richmond around Christmas in 1980. At that point, the case could still be viewed as an isolated tragedy. Crimes happen. People disappear. Bodies are discovered. Investigators begin asking questions. But then Darren Johnsrud disappeared, 16 years old. His body was found the following month. And slowly, the atmosphere began to change. A single murder can create grief. Two can create suspicion. A pattern creates fear. By the summer, British Columbia was confronting something far more frightening than an isolated killer. Young people were vanishing. And in July alone, 6 killings connected to Olson would take place. The speed of the violence changed everything. The investigation could no longer move at an ordinary pace. There were too many unanswered questions. Too many missing names. Too many families waiting by telephones. Too many photographs being passed between investigators. Somewhere among the faces was the face of the person responsible. The police needed to find him before there were more names. And there was another problem. The suspect they would eventually focus on was not an unknown figure hiding completely outside society. Clifford Olson had already been noticed by police. His criminal history meant investigators had reasons to pay attention to him. But recognizing a dangerous man and proving that he is responsible for a series of murders are two very different things. Suspicion is not evidence. A criminal record is not proof of another crime. And in a case involving 11 deaths, the difference mattered. Every accusation had to be examined. Every connection had to be tested. Every detail had to survive scrutiny. Meanwhile, families were living through the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing. That uncertainty has its own kind of cruelty. When someone dies, there is grief. But when someone disappears, there is a terrible space between hope and despair. You can still imagine the door opening. You can still imagine the telephone ringing. You can still tell yourself that perhaps there has been a mistake. Perhaps they are somewhere else. Perhaps they will come home. Until the truth arrives, the mind keeps creating possibilities. And when the truth finally arrives, it can destroy the last refuge those possibilities provided. For the families connected to Olson's victims, that truth came piece by piece. The dead were found. Names were connected. The investigation expanded. And eventually, the police would turn their attention toward the man at the center of the growing nightmare. On August 12, 1981, Clifford Olson was arrested following an incident involving his attempt to approach 2 female hitchhikers. The arrest did not immediately reveal the full scale of what had happened. At first, Olson was connected to the death of Judy Kozma. But what followed would transform the case. Olson began providing information. Information that could potentially lead investigators to the remains of the other victims. And this was where the investigation entered its most morally difficult chapter. Because Olson knew something the families desperately needed to know. He knew where the dead were. The police could take the information, or they could refuse the deal. But refusing might mean losing the opportunity to recover the bodies. Accepting meant negotiating with a suspected serial killer. And Olson understood the power of that position. Imagine sitting across from a man who may have taken someone's child. Imagine knowing that he might be the only person in the room who can tell you where that child is. Then imagine hearing his condition. He will cooperate. But his family must receive money. $100,000. Not directly into his own hands, but into a fund for his wife and children. It was a transaction that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. The money would not erase the killings. It would not bring anyone back. It would not undo the pain. It would not make the families whole. But it could produce something else. Answers. And sometimes, in a murder investigation, answers are the one thing a family needs even when those answers are devastating. For Olson, however, the arrangement also revealed something about the way he viewed the people around him. Even after the deaths, even after his arrest, the dead could still be useful. Their locations could still be traded. Their family's desperation could still become leverage. The bodies were not simply evidence. They were bargaining chips. That is what makes the case so psychologically disturbing. The violence did not necessarily end when the victims died. Their deaths continued to have value in the mind of the man accused of killing them. And perhaps that is one of the darkest aspects of the entire story. A body should be the final physical trace of a human life. For the killer, it became information. Information became power, and power became negotiation. But the police were not dealing only with a manipulative suspect. They were also dealing with the limitations of the justice system itself. What happens when the person who knows the truth is also the person you believe caused the tragedy? What happens when cooperation can save investigators weeks of searching? What happens when refusing a deal might mean leaving families without the ability to bury their children? And what happens when the public learns that money changed hands? These questions would not disappear after the bodies were found. They would follow the case into the courtroom. They would follow Olson into prison. And they would remain part of his legacy long after his death. But in August 1981, none of that was over yet. The investigation was still unfolding. The full list of victims was still being established. The exact extent of Olson's crimes was still coming into focus. And investigators were about to hear a story that would change the case forever. Eventually, Olson would admit responsibility for 11 killings. 11. Not 1. Not 2. 11. But even that confession would not answer every question. Because a confession can close one door while opening another. Why did he do it? How long had he been capable of this? Were all the victims known? Were there other victims? How much did investigators know before his arrest? Could some of the deaths have been prevented? Could more lives have been saved? And perhaps the most painful question of all, how did a man with a known history of criminal behavior remain free long enough to become the center of such a devastating series of crimes? Those questions would remain part of the shadow surrounding the case. In January 1982, the courtroom proceedings began. Olson initially did not plead guilty. But the trial would not become the long, exhaustive examination of evidence that many people might have expected from a case involving 11 alleged murders. Instead, Olson changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to 11 counts of first-degree murder. On January 14, 1982, he received 11 life sentences to be served concurrently, with a minimum of 25 years before eligibility for parole consideration. He was also designated a dangerous offender. The courtroom had reached its conclusion, but for many people, the case did not feel complete. Because a full trial might have exposed evidence, investigative decisions, contradictions, and details that the public never had the opportunity to hear in the same way. Olson's guilty plea brought legal certainty, but it also left behind unanswered questions. And that is where the story becomes something more than the story of a killer. It becomes a story about institutions, about investigators, about desperate families, about bargaining, about the meaning of justice, and about the uncomfortable decisions that can emerge when human lives collide with the machinery of law enforcement. For the victims, there was no appeal, no second chance, no possibility of changing what had happened. For Olson, there would be decades of prison life. He would later seek parole. In 1997, he applied for consideration under the Faint Hope Clause. He was refused. In 2006, he sought parole again. Again, it was denied. In 2010, he made his final attempt. Again, the answer was no. By then, The man who had once used the locations of bodies as bargaining power was an aging prisoner. The years had passed. The headlines had faded. The families had continued living with the consequences. Some had grown older without their children. Some had spent decades carrying photographs of people who never got the chance to grow old themselves. And Olson remained behind bars. On September 30th, 2011, Clifford Olson died of cancer. He was 71 years old. He died in custody. He would never walk free again. But the end of his life did not erase the questions surrounding his crimes. It did not erase the names of the victims. It did not erase the controversy over the $100,000. It did not erase the ethical dilemma created when investigators negotiated with a man accused of murdering children. And it certainly did not erase the empty spaces left in families across British Columbia. That is why the Clifford Olson case continues to haunt the history of Canadian true crime. Not simply because of the number 11, not simply because of the brutality implied by the charges, but because of the choices that followed. A child disappears. A family waits. A body is found. Another child disappears. The list grows. The police search. A suspect emerges. Then the suspect speaks. And suddenly, the people investigating the murders must listen to the person they believe committed them. They must decide what information is worth. They must decide what they are willing to trade. And they must live with that decision. The case forces us to look beyond the image of the solitary monster. Because crimes like these do not exist in a vacuum. There are victims. There are families. There are investigators. There are institutions. There is a public desperate for answers. And there is the offender, sometimes trying to control the narrative even after the crime has been committed. Clifford Olson understood something terrifying. The truth could have value. And if he possessed the truth, then for a time he possessed power. The bodies became evidence. The evidence became leverage. And the leverage became a negotiation. But behind every negotiation was a person who was no longer alive. A name. A face. A family. A life interrupted. That is where this story truly begins. Not with Clifford Olson, but with the people whose lives disappeared into his shadow. Because before he became a name in Canadian criminal history, before the courtroom, before the prison cell, before the controversial deal, there were ordinary young people living ordinary lives. They had families who loved them. They had futures that had not yet happened. And they were never given the chance to see what those futures might have been. The story of Clifford Olson is therefore not simply a story about how a killer was caught. It is a story about what was taken, what was left behind, what the police had to sacrifice to uncover the truth, and what justice can, and sometimes cannot, repair after a life has been taken away. In the chapters that follow, we will go back to the beginning, to British Columbia before the full pattern was visible, to the first disappearance, to the first body, to the families who did not yet know that their personal tragedies would become connected, and finally, to the man who stood at the center of it all. A man whose name would become synonymous with one of Canada's most disturbing serial murder cases, Clifford Olson. But before the name became infamous, there was a 12-year-old girl named Christine and Weller. And somewhere around Christmas of 1980, her death became the first visible piece of a nightmare that no one yet understood. The police did not know how many victims there would be. The families did not know they were part of a pattern. The public did not know a serial killer was operating among them. And the man responsible had not yet revealed the full extent of what he had done. The nightmare had already begun. They simply had not learned its name yet. Before there was a list of 11 names, there was only one. Christine and Weller. 12 years old. A child whose name, at the time, belonged not to a criminal investigation, but to a family, a school, a neighborhood, and a life that was still unfolding. When someone is 12, the future is usually measured in simple things. The next school day, the next weekend, the next birthday, the next summer, the next conversation at the dinner table. At 12, adulthood is still far enough away to feel almost imaginary. There is time. There is supposed to be time. That is what makes the disappearance or death of a child so difficult for the people left behind to comprehend. The future is not supposed to end at 12. And yet, by Christmas 1980, Christine Weller's name had become part of a police investigation in Richmond, British Columbia. Her body had been found. The discovery was terrible in itself. But at that moment, no one looking at the case could have known that her death would eventually be connected to a much larger series of killings. There was no 11-name list yet. There was no public understanding of a serial killer. There was no national conversation about Clifford Olson. There was only a dead 12-year-old girl and the people trying to understand how she had ended up there. That distinction matters. Because when we look backward at a case after everything is known, the past can appear strangely obvious. We see the pattern because we already know the ending. We see the warning signs because we know what they were warning us about. We see the suspect because we know his name. But investigators in December 1980 did not have that luxury. They were standing at the beginning of the story. And beginnings are almost always unclear. A body does not arrive with a complete explanation. A crime scene does not announce the identity of the person responsible. Evidence does not arrange itself into a neat sequence. Instead, investigators receive fragments. A location. A time. A name. A missing person report. A statement from a witness. A detail that seems insignificant until months later, when it suddenly becomes important. The first task is not solving the entire case. It is simply understanding what happened. Who is this person? Where had they been? Who had seen them last? Who knew them? Who might have had a reason to hurt them? Was the death accidental? Was it deliberate? Was it connected to another crime? At the beginning, almost every possibility has to remain open. That uncertainty would become one of the defining features of the Olson case. Because while investigators were still trying to understand Christine's death, another young person would disappear. Then another. Then another. And with every new name, the possibility of coincidence became harder to accept. But coincidence can be stubborn. It can keep an investigation trapped for longer than anyone realizes. One missing teenager can be explained in dozens of ways. A young person might have left home voluntarily. They might have gone somewhere without telling their parents. They might have stayed with a friend. They might have gotten into trouble. They might have been afraid of something. They might have simply wanted to disappear for a while. Families can spend hours, days, sometimes longer, trying to decide which possibility to believe. And during those hours, the police have to determine which possibility is most consistent with the evidence. The problem is that missing people are not equations. There is no formula that can predict what someone has done. And every family has its own history, its own routines, its own understanding of what is normal. When a child suddenly does something unusual, the family may initially interpret it through the lens of ordinary life. They might think the child is angry. They might think the child is rebellious. They might think the child simply needs space. But sometimes the last ordinary explanation is the one that keeps people from seeing the extraordinary danger standing just outside the frame. That is why the passage of time becomes so important in missing person cases. At first, the clock moves normally. Then every hour begins to feel different. 1 hour becomes 2. 2 becomes 6. 6 becomes 12. A night passes. Morning comes. The phone remains silent. The door remains closed. And hope begins competing with fear. For families, this is not an abstract psychological process. It is physical. You walk from room to room. You look at the telephone. You check the street. You replay the last conversation. You remember the clothes. You remember the expression on their face. You remember something they said that seemed meaningless at the time. Then you wonder whether it meant something else. This is the kind of uncertainty that surrounded the victims connected to Clifford Olson. And as 1981 progressed, that uncertainty became more widespread. Darren Todd Johnsrud was 16. His disappearance in April would become another piece of the developing pattern. His body was found in May. Again, investigators had a young victim. Again, there was a death to explain. But now there were two. Christine. Darren. 2 names. 2 families. 2 investigations. And slowly, the possibility emerged that these were not isolated events. Still, the full pattern was not yet visible. That is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Serial murder is often described after the fact as though it has a clear beginning. As though the moment the first victim is killed, the existence of the serial killer becomes obvious. Real investigations are rarely so clean. The people involved are living through events one at a time. The second victim does not know they are the second victim. The family of the first victim does not know that another family will soon experience the same horror. The police do not know how many victims there will be. And the public has no reason to imagine that an apparently isolated crime could become part of a much larger nightmare. Then came June. Ada Anita Court was 13. Her name joined the growing investigation. By this point, the atmosphere had changed. The age of the victims was becoming impossible to ignore. Children, teenagers, young people, people who should have been going to school, meeting friends, arguing with parents, making plans, worrying about ordinary things. Instead, investigators were searching for answers surrounding their deaths. And then came July. July 1981 would become the month in which the case accelerated with terrifying speed. 6 killings attributed to Olson occurred during that single month. 6. In the span of weeks, the investigation moved from a troubling collection of cases towards something much darker. The number of victims was no longer something investigators could casually place in separate files. The cases were beginning to overlap. Patterns were beginning to emerge. And somewhere within those patterns was a man who had already spent years in contact with the criminal justice system. Clifford Olson. The name was not completely unfamiliar to authorities. That mattered. Olson had a criminal history. He had already been involved in theft, violence, and sexual offenses. His past did not prove that he had committed the killings. But it meant that when investigators began looking at possible suspects, his name carried weight. There is a particular danger in investigations involving people with criminal histories. Sometimes a record can blind investigators. A person with a history of crime can become an easy target for suspicion. But the opposite danger exists too. A person can have a criminal record and still be innocent of a particular crime. Investigators have to separate what they know from what they assume. They have to ask the harder question. What connects this person to this victim? Not to another crime. Not to an old conviction. Not to a reputation. To this victim. And then the next victim. And the next. In Olson's case, that distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation developed. Because suspicion would eventually become evidence. And evidence would eventually become a confession. But there was still a long way to go. In July, the number of victims continued to rise. Simon Patrick Partington was 9 years old. That number changes the emotional landscape of a case. When a victim is 9, people do not think of an independent adult making decisions about their life. They think of a child. A child who should be protected. A child who should be walking home from school, playing, learning, asking questions, growing taller year by year. 9 years old is an age at which the world is still largely controlled by adults. Parents decide when dinner is, when bedtime is, where the child can go, who they can visit. The very idea that a stranger, or anyone with malicious intent, could take control of that world is terrifying. Then there was Judy Elizabeth Kozma, 14 years old. Her death would later become particularly important because Olson would eventually be charged in connection with it after his arrest. Then Raymond Lawrence King, 15. Sigrun Charlotte Arndt, 18. Terry Lynn Carson, 15. Louise Marie Chartrand, 17. Sandra Wolf-Steiner, 16. Each name represented a separate life, but investigators increasingly had to consider them together. That is when a murder investigation becomes something different. The question is no longer simply, who killed this person? It becomes, who could have killed all of them? And that question changes everything. The suspect pool becomes more complicated. The evidence has to be compared. Timelines have to be reconstructed. Relationships have to be examined. Locations have to be connected. Investigators have to determine whether similarities are meaningful or merely coincidental. They have to understand the behavior of the offender. And perhaps most importantly, they have to understand how the offender finds victims. A killer who attacks randomly creates one kind of investigative problem. A killer who selects victims according to a particular pattern creates another. The pattern itself can become a fingerprint. But patterns are only useful if investigators can see them. In July 1981, the pattern was still emerging. Meanwhile, the lower mainland continued to function. Cars moved through streets. People went to work. Stores opened. Schools operated. Families made dinner. Children went outside. Life continued. That normality is one of the strangest features of major criminal cases. A community can be living through a nightmare without everyone knowing it. Fear spreads unevenly. Some people hear rumors. Others read newspaper reports. Some parents become more cautious. Others continue with their routines because they do not know what else to do. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary life, a killer can move. That is part of what makes serial murder so psychologically devastating. The threat is invisible until it is not. There is no obvious boundary between a safe street and a dangerous one. No sign that says danger begins here. No warning that identifies the person standing nearby. The absence of certainty becomes part of the fear. And for the investigators, uncertainty becomes pressure. They are not simply trying to solve a crime that has already happened. They are trying to prevent another one. Every hour without an arrest can feel like an hour in which another person could disappear. Every unanswered question becomes urgent. Every lead has to be evaluated. Every suspect has to be considered. And every mistake becomes more costly. By the summer of 1981, Clifford Olson had come to the attention of investigators. His criminal background made him a person of interest. But interest is not the same as certainty. Police still needed evidence. They needed to understand his movements. They needed to connect him to victims. They needed something that could survive the scrutiny of a courtroom. And the case was moving toward a moment when all of those pieces would collide. That moment came in August. On August 12, 1981, Olson was arrested following an incident involving his attempt to approach two female hitchhikers. The arrest was not the dramatic conclusion to the investigation that people might imagine today. It was a beginning. A door had opened. And behind it was a story far larger than investigators initially knew. Olson would soon be connected to Judy Kozma's death. But then something extraordinary happened. He began to talk. For investigators, a suspect who speaks can be a gift. For investigators dealing with a suspected serial killer, a suspect who speaks can also be a trap. Every word has to be tested. Every claim has to be verified. A confession can be false. A suspect can lie to protect himself. A suspect can lie to manipulate investigators. A suspect can tell the truth selectively. And Olson appeared to understand the value of information. He could give them locations. He could provide details. He could potentially lead them to the remains of victims who had not yet been found. For the families, this was unimaginable. Imagine spending weeks or months wondering where your child is. Then imagine police telling you that the suspect may know. Not may have heard. Not may have seen. May know. Where? The location. The place where the search should begin. The possibility of recovery. The possibility of confirmation. The possibility of finally ending the terrible uncertainty. But there was a price. 100,000 Canadian dollars. The money would go into a fund for Olson's wife and children. And suddenly, the investigation became a moral negotiation. The police needed the information. Olson had it. He had something they could not simply obtain through another witness. And he understood that. This is where the phrase cash for bodies became attached to the case. 3 words that would eventually become more famous than many of the details surrounding the investigation itself. Because the phrase captures the basic horror of the arrangement. Money was connected to information about human remains. But behind those remains were people. Children. Teenagers. Sons and daughters. The question was not simply whether Olson deserved the money. The deeper question was whether the authorities should have offered any benefit at all to a man who claimed responsibility for multiple murders. Some people would argue that recovering the bodies mattered more. Others would argue that the state should never reward a killer for information about his own crimes. Both positions begin with something understandable. One begins with the needs of the families. The other begins with the principles of justice. And between them stood a police investigation trying to make impossible decisions under extraordinary pressure. That is the point where the Clifford Olson story stops being only a murder investigation. It becomes a story about power. Olson had been arrested. But he was not powerless. He still possessed information. And that information had value. He could decide what to reveal. He could decide when to reveal it. He could force investigators to negotiate. The man in custody could still influence what happened outside the prison walls. That is a chilling reversal. Normally, once a suspect is arrested, the power begins moving toward the state. The police have the suspect. The suspect is restrained. The evidence is collected. The case moves toward court. But Olson had something unusual. He had the locations of the dead. And the dead could not speak for themselves. Their families could not tell investigators where they were. The missing could not point toward the places where their lives had ended. Only Olson could. And so the investigation entered a strange new phase. The police had to listen. They had to decide what to believe. And they had to follow him. One location at a time. One victim at a time. One terrible answer at a time. But even as the bodies were being located and the scope of the crimes became clearer, another question began to emerge. How many? How many people had been killed? How many families had been left waiting? How many crimes had Olson committed that investigators did not yet know about? And perhaps the darkest possibility. Was 11 the complete number? Or simply the number he was willing to admit? Those questions would follow the case for years. Olson would eventually plead guilty to 11 counts of first-degree murder. But before that happened, investigators had to build a case around a man who seemed determined to control the story. He had the information. He knew the locations. He could choose what to reveal. And for a time, he had something else. He had the attention of an entire justice system. The public wanted answers. Families wanted their children found. Police wanted evidence. And Olson had learned that the truth could be traded. That is the central tension at the heart of this story. Not simply the question of who killed 11 people, but the question of what happens when the person who knows the truth understands exactly how badly everyone else needs it. Years later, Olson would remain behind bars. He would apply for parole. He would be refused. He would apply again. He would be refused again. And in 2010, his final attempt would fail. Then, on September 30th, 2011, nearly 3 decades after his arrest, Clifford Olson would die of cancer at the age of 71. He died in custody. The prison doors remained closed. The legal case was long finished. But the story was not. Because there are cases that end with an arrest. There are cases that end with a conviction. And there are cases that continue long after the offender is gone. The Olson case belongs to the third category. It continues because of the victims. It continues because of their families. It continues because of the questions surrounding the investigation. It continues because of the $100,000. It continues because Olson's guilty plea meant that the public never witnessed the complete presentation of evidence that a full trial might have provided. And it continues because the human mind searches for meaning when confronted with something that seems impossible to understand. How does someone become capable of taking so many lives? How does a person look at a child and see an opportunity rather than a human being? How does someone continue to negotiate after the victim is dead? How does a person use the location of a body as leverage? And what does that reveal about the person who is doing it? These questions cannot be answered simply by calling someone evil. That word is easy. Understanding is harder. To understand is not to excuse. To examine the psychology of a killer is not to sympathize with the killer. It is to ask what happened inside a human mind that allowed empathy to become so distorted that other human beings could be reduced to objects, opportunities, or bargaining pieces. In Olson's case, the answer is not contained in a single moment. It lies somewhere within years of behavior, choices, criminal history, relationships, violence, and manipulation. But there is one thing that must remain clear. Understanding the offender must never eclipse the victims. The camera of this story should not remain fixed on the killer. It must return again and again to the people whose lives were stolen. Christine, Darren, Ada, Simon, Judy, Raymond, Sigrun, Terry, Louise, Sandra, and the others whose names became part of Olson's confession. 11 lives. 11 families. 11 futures that stopped. And countless people left behind to carry the consequences. That is why this story begins with a name. Not because the name belongs to the killer, but because the first name belongs to a child. Christine and Weller, 12 years old. Her death was not a chapter in a true crime story when it happened. It was a catastrophe for the people who loved her. The distinction is important. True crime often compresses human beings into facts. Age, date, location, cause of death. But those facts are only the skeleton of a story. The real story is what those facts meant to the people who lived through them. A birthday that would never come. A Christmas that would never be the same. A bedroom that would remain painfully familiar. A photograph that would become more valuable with every passing year. A family that would grow older while the child in the photograph never did. Those are the consequences of murder that no courtroom sentence can fully measure. And that is where we need to begin. Not with the arrest. Not with the confession. Not with the infamous deal. Not even with the killer. We begin before the pattern was visible. Before the public understood. Before investigators knew what they were looking at. Before 11 names became one case. We begin with a 12-year-old girl whose death appeared, at first, to be a terrible tragedy standing alone. Because sometimes the darkest patterns begin with something that looks like a single event. One body. One family. One investigation. One unanswered question. And then another name appears. And another. And another. Until the isolated pieces begin to form a picture. And once that picture becomes visible, it becomes impossible to look away. The summer of 1981 was approaching its end. The investigation was closing in. Clifford Olson was about to become the central figure in one of Canada's most notorious criminal cases. But the full story had not yet been told. The bodies still had to be found. The evidence still had to be gathered. The families still had to receive answers. And the country was about to learn just how much darkness could hide behind one ordinary name. Clifford Olson. A man who had already been known to police. A man who had already lived on the edges of criminal society. A man who would eventually admit to 11 murders. But before that confession, before the courtroom, before the prison years, there was a summer when the names of young people were appearing in newspapers with increasing frequency. A summer when families were learning to fear the telephone. A summer when investigators were trying to connect crimes that did not yet have a single face. A summer when 6 lives would be taken in 1 month. And somewhere in British Columbia, a man was carrying a secret that would soon become impossible to contain. The secret was not only who had died. It was where they were. And Olson knew. That knowledge would become his weapon, his bargaining power, his final opportunity to control the story. But the dead could not bargain. They could not negotiate. They could not ask for money. They could not speak to investigators. They could only wait in the places where they had been left, waiting to be found. And that is where the next chapter begins, with the search for the missing, with the families waiting for answers, and with investigators following the trail toward a man who had something they desperately needed, the truth. There is a moment in every investigation when the case changes. Sometimes it happens when a crucial piece of evidence is discovered. Sometimes it happens when a witness finally speaks. Sometimes it happens when a suspect makes a mistake. And sometimes it happens when investigators realize that the thing they thought they were looking at is not the thing that is actually in front of them. The Clifford Olson investigation was moving toward such a moment. For months, the disappearances and deaths had existed as separate tragedies. Christine Weller, Darren Johnsrud, Ada Court, then the devastating sequence of July. Simon Partington, Judy Kozma, Raymond King, Sigrun Arndt, Terry Carson, Louise Chartrand, Sandra Wolfsteiner. 11 victims would eventually be attributed to Olson. But investigators did not begin with 11. They began with 1. Then 2. Then 3. The pattern was built backward. Every new discovery forced investigators to look again at what they thought they already understood. That is one of the cruelest realities of a serial murder investigation. The past keeps changing. A case that seemed isolated yesterday can become connected to something else tomorrow. A detail that meant nothing suddenly matters. A name that once appeared in one file suddenly appears in another. A person who seemed peripheral becomes central. And a suspect who seemed merely suspicious becomes impossible to ignore. By the summer of 1981, Clifford Olson was no longer simply a man with a criminal history. He was becoming a man whose name appeared within an investigation that was growing darker by the week. But even then, the police had a problem. They needed to know what Olson knew. And they needed to know whether he was telling the truth. A killer's confession is not automatically the end of an investigation. In some ways, it can be the beginning of an entirely new one. Because when a suspect says, "I did it," investigators have to ask another question. How do you know? What information could only the perpetrator know? What details can be independently verified? Where are the bodies? Where did the victims disappear? What happened between the last confirmed sighting and the discovery of the remains? Does the suspect's account match the physical evidence? Does it match the timeline? Does it match what witnesses remember? And perhaps most importantly, is the suspect confessing because he wants to tell the truth, or because he wants something? With Olson, that final question would become impossible to separate from everything that followed. He had information. The authorities wanted that information, and Olson knew its value. This created a relationship unlike the one most people imagine when they think about an arrest. The police had arrested him, but Olson still had something they needed. He had the locations. The power was no longer entirely on one side. There was a negotiation. And the subject of that negotiation was not property. It was the dead. 100,000 Canadian dollars would eventually be placed into a fund for Olson's wife and children. The arrangement would become notorious. To the public, the image was almost unbearable. A suspected serial killer had information about the remains of his victims, and the state had agreed to provide a financial benefit to his family in exchange for cooperation. The money did not go directly into Olson's hands. That distinction mattered legally and practically, but it did not erase the moral discomfort, because the fundamental question remained. Should a killer receive anything of value for revealing where he left his victims? There are moments in criminal justice when principles collide with reality. This was one of them. On one side were the rules. On the other were families waiting for answers. On one side was the fear that negotiating with an offender could reward manipulation. On the other was the possibility that refusing to negotiate would leave victims undiscovered. And somewhere between those two positions stood the investigators. They were not negotiating in a vacuum. They were dealing with 11 lives. Or, at that stage, with a number of victims whose final total was still becoming clear. They had to think about the families. They had to think about evidence. They had to think about prosecution. They had to think about what could happen if Olson stopped talking. And they had to consider whether every piece of information he offered could be verified. The decision was made. The information was obtained. And the search for the victims' remains could proceed. But the controversy would remain. Long after the investigation ended. Long after the courtroom proceedings. Long after Olson was behind bars. The phrase would remain. Cash for bodies. 3 words that condensed an enormous ethical debate into something the public could repeat. But the phrase also risked reducing the case to a controversy. And that would be another injustice. Because beneath the controversy were people. The dead were not bargaining pieces. They were not evidence numbers. They were not locations on a map. They were human beings. And their families had waited for them. For a family, the discovery of a body can be both devastating and merciful. Devastating because the last hope disappears. Merciful because uncertainty finally ends. There is a terrible finality in knowing. But there can also be a terrible cruelty in not knowing. The human mind does not like unanswered endings. When someone disappears, the imagination fills the empty space. Maybe they are alive. Maybe they are somewhere far away. Maybe they will return. Maybe the next phone call will change everything. Hope can survive almost anything when there is no proof that it should die. But once a body is found, hope has nowhere left to go. There is only grief. And grief, unlike uncertainty, has a shape. It has a name. It has a place. It has something to mourn. That is why the recovery of the victims was so important. Not because bodies solve crimes by themselves. Not because physical evidence can explain a person's entire life. But because families deserved the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. They deserved to know that their children had been found. They deserved the chance to say goodbye. And they deserved to stop searching. The investigation was therefore about more than catching Olson. It was about recovering people from the places where he had left them. That distinction should never be forgotten, because true crime has a dangerous tendency to move toward the perpetrator. The killer has the dramatic name. The killer has the criminal profile. The killer has the courtroom photographs. The killer has the prison interviews. The killer becomes the subject of documentaries. But the victims rarely get the same attention. Their stories are often reduced to age and date. Their lives become footnotes beneath the name of the person who killed them. That cannot happen here. Christine Weller was more than 12. Darren Johnsrud was more than 16. Ada Court was more than 13. Simon Partington was more than 9. Judy Kozma was more than 14. Raymond King was more than 15. Sigrun Arndt was more than 18. Terry Carson was more than 15. Louise Chartrand was more than 17. Sandra Wolf Steiner was more than 16. And the 11th victim was more than a final number in a confession. Every one of them was a person before they became a case. Every one of them had people who knew them before they became a name in a newspaper. Every one of them had a life that existed independently of the man who eventually became infamous for their deaths. The investigation could not give them their lives back. No investigation can, but it could establish what happened. And sometimes establishing the truth is the only form of restoration that remains possible. The arrest of Olson marked the beginning of that process. Yet the most extraordinary part of the story was still ahead, because Olson did not simply confess and disappear into the prison system. He would eventually become one of the most controversial figures in Canadian criminal history. His courtroom appearance would be brief compared with what might have been expected from 11 murder charges. The case would not unfold as a prolonged trial in which every piece of evidence was examined publicly. Instead, Olson would change his plea. He would plead guilty. 11 times. 11 counts of first-degree murder. And on January 14, 1982, the legal system would deliver its judgment. 11 life sentences. Concurrent sentences. A minimum of 25 years before eligibility for parole consideration. And the designation of dangerous offender. From the outside, it might appear to be the final page. The killer had been identified. The victims had been accounted for. The court had imposed punishment. The prison doors had closed. Case closed. But the reality was much more complicated. A guilty plea can provide certainty. It can establish responsibility. It can prevent families from having to endure a long and emotionally brutal trial. But it can also leave questions unanswered. What would have emerged if the trial had continued? What evidence would the public have heard? What details would investigators have been forced to explain? What contradictions might have been exposed? What information might have emerged about the investigation itself? A full trial can become a public examination of everything. A guilty plea can shorten that process dramatically. In Olson's case, that meant that some questions remained. Not necessarily questions about whether Olson was responsible for the murders to which he pleaded guilty, but questions about the full circumstances surrounding the crimes and the investigation. Could he ever be released? The answer would eventually become clear. No, at least not during his lifetime. In 1997, Olson sought consideration under the faint hope clause. He was refused. Almost 3 decades after the murders, the name Clifford Olson still carried enough weight that his possible release remained a matter of public concern. In 2006, he sought parole again. Again, he was denied. And in 2010, his final attempt also failed. By then, the world in which his crimes had occurred was decades in the past. The young victims would have been adults. Some would have been middle-aged. Had they lived, they would have experienced years that Olson never allowed them to see. They might have married. They might have built careers. They might have had children. They might have moved to different cities. They might have become grandparents. They might have changed their minds about what they wanted from life. They might have failed at things. They might have succeeded. They might have become ordinary adults with ordinary problems. None of those possibilities would ever exist. That is the true measure of a murder. Not simply the moment when a life ends, but all the years that are erased with it. A person does not lose only the day of their death. They lose every future day, every future conversation, every future birthday, every future mistake, every future success, every future morning, every future evening, every version of themselves they would have become. And the people who loved them lose all of those possibilities too. That is why the 11 murders attributed to Olson cannot be reduced to a number. 11 is a count. It is not a measure of loss. The loss is larger. It spreads outward, into families, friendships, communities, and into the lives of people who never knew the victims but later learned their names. The case became part of Canadian history. But history can be dangerous when it becomes too distant. Distance makes tragedy easier to consume. The year becomes a number. The victims become names. The killer becomes a headline. And the human reality disappears. So before we move deeper into the case, it is worth stopping here. For a moment, forget the courtroom. Forget the prison. Forget the money. Forget the phrase serial killer. Think instead about a family waiting for a child. Think about a photograph. Think about a room. Think about a place at a table that remains empty. Think about a voice that will never be heard again. Think about a future that disappeared without permission. That is the true beginning of this story. Not the moment Olson was arrested. The beginning was the moment someone's absence was noticed. The moment a family realized something was wrong. The moment someone asked, "Where are they?" That question came again and again. Where is Christine? Where is Darren? Where is Ada? Where is Simon? Where is Judy? Where is Raymond? Where is Sigrun? Where is Terry? Where is Louise? Where is Sandra? Where are the others? Those questions are more important than the mythology that would eventually surround Clifford Olson. Because the victims did not disappear from history. They disappeared from their own futures. And the job of the investigation was to bring their stories back into the light. The police would eventually identify Olson. The courts would eventually sentence him. The prison system would eventually keep him confined. Cancer would eventually end his life. But none of those events could undo what had already happened. Justice has limits. It can punish. It can establish responsibility. It can protect the public. It can preserve evidence. It can tell a family that the person responsible will not walk free. But justice cannot reverse time. It cannot open a bedroom door and return a child. It cannot restore a voice. It cannot create the future that was stolen. That is why the aftermath of a murder is often longer than the murder itself. The crime may take minutes. The investigation may take months. The trial may take days. The sentence may last decades. But grief can last a lifetime. For the victims' families, there is no parole. There is no release date. There is no point when the loss expires. And that is something a prison sentence can never fully capture. Clifford Olson died in 2011. 30 years had passed since his arrest. 30 years since the summer when the investigation had consumed British Columbia. 30 years since 11 families had been forced to confront the worst kind of loss. Olson was 71. He died behind bars. The man was gone. But the victims remained. Not physically, but in memory. In photographs. In family stories. In records. In the people who still remembered them. And that is where the balance of this story must always remain. The killer may be the reason the case became famous. But the victims are the reason the case matters. There is a temptation in true crime to ask what made the killer fascinating. What made him different? What made him dangerous? What was inside his mind? Those questions can be useful. They can help investigators, psychologists, and the public understand patterns of behavior. But there is another question that deserves equal attention. What was lost? The answer is not simply 11 lives. It is 11 futures. 11 families' expectations. 11 sets of relationships. 11 possibilities that were never allowed to unfold. And the ripple effect does not stop there. Every victim leaves behind people. Parents. Siblings. Friends. Neighbors. Teachers. Classmates. People whose own lives are permanently altered by the disappearance of someone they knew. The death of one person can change the lives of dozens, sometimes hundreds. And the consequences continue across generations. That is why the Clifford Olson case cannot be understood only through the lens of the man who committed the crimes. It must be understood through the people who survived them, and through the institutions that responded. The police. The courts. The parole system. The public. The media. Every part of the system had decisions to make. Some decisions were successful. Some were controversial. Some remained debated. But all of them formed part of the legacy. The most controversial decision remains the financial arrangement. $100,000. A fund. A killer. The locations of bodies. A bargain. It is difficult to imagine a more uncomfortable combination. Yet the reality of criminal investigation is that the clean moral choices people prefer to imagine are not always available. Investigators are often forced to choose between imperfect options. And sometimes the consequences of choosing one imperfect option are visible for decades. That is what happened here. The bodies were located. Information was obtained. The case moved forward. But the public anger did not disappear. The question remained. Was it worth it? That question has no simple answer. If the information allowed families to recover their children, that mattered. If the agreement encouraged a killer to manipulate authorities, that mattered too. Both things can be true. And perhaps that is why the case remains so compelling. There is no single clean lesson. There is no moment when everything becomes morally simple. There is only a sequence of decisions made under pressure, followed by consequences that lasted for years. The same is true of Olson's guilty plea. It brought legal resolution, but it also shortened the public examination of the evidence. Again, two truths can coexist. The families may have been spared an even longer ordeal, and the public may have been denied a fuller understanding of the case. Justice was achieved in one sense. Questions remained in another. That tension is part of the story, and it is precisely why we must resist turning the case into a simple tale of a monster who was caught and punished. That version is easier to tell, but it is not enough. The deeper story is about how a society responds when faced with an offender who understands how to exploit desperation. It is about what happens when evidence becomes leverage. It is about the value of truth. And it is about the price people are willing to pay for it. But before we reach those questions, we have to return to the beginning. To a time when nobody knew Clifford Olson's name would become synonymous with 11 murders. To a time when Christine Weller was not the first victim in a series. She was simply Christine, a 12-year-old girl. And her family was simply a family waiting for her. That is how these stories begin. Not with a killer. With an absence. A person is not there. Someone notices. Someone worries. Someone calls. Someone searches. And eventually, someone finds something that changes everything. For Christine, that discovery came around Christmas of 1980. For Darren, it came months later. For the others, the pattern continued. Each death brought investigators closer to a truth that was still hidden. Each name made the previous names more significant. Until finally, the separate tragedies became one case. And the one case had a suspect. Clifford Olson. The man who would later stand in court and admit responsibility. The man who would spend the rest of his life in custody. The man whose knowledge of the victim's final locations would become a bargaining instrument. But the story of how investigators reached that point is not a straight line. There were leads. There were questions. There were suspicions. There were moments when the investigation moved forward. And there were moments when certainty remained just out of reach. That is where the next chapter takes us. Away from the name Clifford Olson. Away from the infamous negotiation. Away from the courtroom. And back to the people whose lives existed before the case had a name. To the homes. The families. The routines. The ordinary days. Because if we want to understand what was taken, we first have to understand what existed before it was taken. And that means remembering the victims as people. Not numbers. Not evidence. Not chapters in the biography of a killer. People. Young people who had futures. People whose lives mattered long before anyone knew their names would one day be spoken in connection with one of Canada's most notorious criminal cases. The story begins there. And this time, we do not begin with the killer. We begin with the lives he interrupted. Before a place becomes associated with a crime, it is simply a place where people live. British Columbia was not born in the history books as the setting for one of Canada's most notorious serial murder cases. It was a province of ordinary lives. Families lived their routines. Children went to school. Teenagers made plans with friends. People went to work, drove through familiar streets, visited stores, met relatives, and returned home at the end of the day. The places where the victims lived were not designed for tragedy. They were designed for life. And that is important to remember when looking back at the Clifford Olson case. Because the word serial killer changes the way we see a place. Once we know what happened, ordinary streets can begin to look sinister. A quiet road becomes a potential hiding place. A stretch of land becomes part of a crime scene. A neighborhood becomes connected to a map of disappearances. A name that once meant nothing suddenly carries the weight of fear. But the people living there did not have the benefit of hindsight. They were not walking through a landscape marked with invisible warnings. They were living their lives. The lower mainland of British Columbia became the geographical center of the investigation. This region would eventually become inseparable from the story of Clifford Olson and the victims whose lives were taken between late 1980 and the summer of 1981. But in the beginning, there was no single crime scene. There was no single location that contained the entire story. There were different people, different disappearances, different investigations, different families. The connections came later. That is one of the reasons the case is so difficult to understand from the perspective of someone looking backward. Today, we can take the known facts and arrange them in chronological order. Christine Weller, Darren Johnsrud, Ada Court. Then the victims whose deaths occurred during the terrible acceleration of July 1981. The sequence looks frighteningly clear. But history is rarely experienced in sequence. People experience it one day at a time. On one day, a family is waiting for someone to come home. On another day, a police officer is examining a new report. On another, a newspaper prints a new name. On another, a body is found. Each event changes the meaning of what came before. The first death does not arrive with a label saying, beginning of a series. It is simply a death. The second does not necessarily arrive with an explanation connecting it to the first. The third forces investigators to reconsider. And then, at some point, the accumulation becomes too great to ignore. That transition, from isolated tragedies to a recognizable pattern, is one of the most important parts of the setting. Because the danger was not immediately visible. There was no public announcement at the beginning saying that a serial killer was moving through the lower mainland. There was no clear face attached to the fear. There was simply uncertainty. And uncertainty changes the atmosphere of a community. When a person disappears, people begin asking questions. When another person disappears, those questions become more urgent. When young people begin appearing among the missing and the dead, parents begin to look at the world differently. A familiar world can become unfamiliar without changing physically at all. The same road is still there. The same buildings are still there. The same neighborhoods are still there. But the way people see them changes. That psychological transformation is often overlooked when discussing criminal cases. Fear does not always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives quietly. It changes decisions. It changes routines. It changes the way parents think about where their children are. It changes the way people interpret strangers. It changes the meaning of an unanswered telephone. It changes what someone notices when a child is late. And perhaps most importantly, it changes what people believe is possible. Before a terrible crime happens, many dangers exist only as possibilities. Afterward, those possibilities become real. The lower mainland in 1980 and 1981 was therefore not simply a backdrop. It became part of the psychological landscape of the investigation. Richmond was connected to the discovery of Christine Weller's body. Other locations became associated with other victims. The geography of the case slowly expanded through the places where the victims had been found or where investigators believed information could lead them. And as the investigation progressed, those places became more than points on a map. Each one represented a question. What happened here? Who was here? Who had been here before? Who knew the victim? Who might have seen something? Who might have information? And how was this location connected to the others? Investigators were effectively trying to turn geography into evidence. A location can tell a story, but only if it is interpreted correctly. The distance between two places can matter. The timing can matter. The accessibility of a location can matter. The relationship between a victim and a place can matter. But geography alone cannot identify a killer. It becomes meaningful when combined with behavior, witness accounts, physical evidence, timelines, and other investigative information. That process takes time. And time was something the investigators increasingly did not have. The deaths were accumulating. The summer of 1981 was approaching. Then July arrived. 6 of the killings attributed to Olson occurred during that month. 6. The number alone creates a sense of acceleration. But the emotional reality is more difficult to measure. For 6 families, July was not a chapter in a crime timeline. It was the month everything changed. One family lost a child. Another family lost a teenager. Another family began searching. Another received news they had been desperately hoping would never come. And while each family experienced its own private tragedy, investigators were beginning to confront a larger possibility. These deaths might be connected. That possibility changes an investigation completely. A homicide investigator dealing with one victim has one central story to reconstruct. A serial murder investigation requires several stories to be reconstructed at once. Each victim has to be understood independently. Then the cases have to be compared. What is similar? What is different? Where do the timelines overlap? What relationships exist? What locations appear more than once? What names appear in more than one investigation? What behavior could connect the crimes? And what information could be misleading? This is where criminal investigation becomes a process of separating signal from noise. Every case contains details. Not every detail matters. Some clues are meaningful. Some are accidental. Some are misleading. Some become meaningful only after another piece of evidence is discovered. The investigators could not simply assume that every similarity meant a connection. They had to prove it. That is especially important when the suspect pool includes someone with a criminal history. Clifford Olson was not an unknown man with no previous contact with law enforcement. He had a record involving criminal behavior, including theft, violence, and sexual offenses. That history mattered. But it could not, by itself, establish responsibility for 11 murders. A criminal record tells investigators something about a person's past. It does not automatically tell them what that person did on a particular day. The difference is fundamental. An investigation built entirely on assumptions can become dangerous. The correct question was not simply whether Olson was capable of committing violence. The question was whether he was connected to these victims. And if he was, how? The answer would eventually emerge. But before that happened, investigators were operating within a world where information was incomplete. The public had incomplete information too. Newspaper reports could describe disappearances. Families could appeal for help. Police could release certain details. Rumors could spread. But no one outside the investigation had the complete picture. And even inside the investigation, the complete picture did not exist yet. This is another important feature of the setting. The truth was fragmented. One person knew one detail. Another person knew another. A family knew the victim's routines. A witness might know something they had seen. An investigator might recognize a connection between two reports. Another investigator might be examining evidence somewhere else. The truth was distributed among people who did not necessarily know how their pieces fit together. That is often how major investigations work. The final narrative can look coherent. The process of discovering it is anything but coherent. There are unanswered questions. There are competing theories. There are false leads. There are moments of confidence followed by doubt. And there is always the pressure of knowing that another person may be in danger. By the summer of 1981, that pressure was becoming enormous. The deaths of young people were no longer isolated events that could be examined without considering the others. The possibility of a serial offender changed the stakes. A serial offender does not simply leave victims behind. He creates a pattern of fear. The public begins to ask whether anyone is safe. Parents begin to wonder whether their children could become the next victim. And investigators begin to understand that solving the existing crimes may also be the only way to prevent another. That creates a race against time. Every lead becomes urgent. Every suspect must be evaluated. Every piece of information must be examined. And every delay carries a potential cost. Yet the community itself continued to function. That contradiction is essential to understanding the case. A city or region does not stop because a murder investigation is underway. People still wake up. They still go to work. They still go shopping. Children still go outside. Cars still travel the roads. The ordinary world continues alongside the extraordinary crime. For the families involved, however, ordinary life has already been shattered. The same world that feels normal to one person can feel terrifying to another. A parent whose child is missing does not experience an ordinary afternoon. A family waiting for a telephone call does not experience an ordinary evening. A police officer assigned to a disappearance does not see an ordinary report. The setting is physically the same. That difference between public normality and private terror is one of the defining characteristics of true crime. The community sees headlines. The family sees an empty room. The police see a file. The family sees a photograph. The public sees a name. The family hears a voice in memory. And this is why the victims must remain at the center of the story. Before Christine Weller became the first name in a series, she was a 12-year-old girl. Before Darren Johnsrud became a murder victim, he was a 16-year-old boy. Before Ada Court became part of a police investigation, she was 13. Before Simon Partington's name appeared in connection with the case, he was 9. Their ages tell us how young they were. But age alone cannot tell us who they were. That is something we will have to explore through the lives they left behind. For now, the important point is that the setting was populated by people who had no idea they would become part of a national criminal story. The Lower Mainland was not a crime scene. It was home. And home is precisely what makes the story more painful. A crime committed in an unfamiliar place can feel distant. A crime that occurs within a person's ordinary world feels different. The places we trust are built through repetition. We recognize them. We know the route. We know where things are. We develop an assumption that familiarity equals safety. The Olson case challenged that assumption, because the victims were not taken from some distant, imaginary world. They were young people living within ordinary communities. And the man eventually connected to their deaths was not some unknown figure who had appeared from nowhere. Clifford Olson had been moving through the same society. He had a criminal history. He had interacted with people. He had been visible. That fact would become increasingly important as investigators examined how the crimes had been committed and how Olson had been able to operate. But before we reach those questions, we need to understand the historical moment. The case unfolded in the early 1980s. There was no internet. There were no smartphones. There was no instant access to a database from a device in a police officer's hand. There were no social media alerts spreading information across a community within minutes. Communication operated differently. Investigations operated differently. Information moved through reports, telephone calls, interviews, physical records, and direct communication. That technological difference matters. Modern audiences can sometimes imagine that investigators in the past had access to the same tools available today. They did not. A missing person's photograph could not be shared instantly across thousands of phones. A suspect's identity could not be searched with a few keystrokes from almost anywhere. Investigative information had to be gathered, documented, compared, and communicated through the systems available at the time. That did not make investigators less capable, but it created different limitations. And in a case moving as quickly as the Olson investigation, limitations mattered. The RCMP would eventually become deeply involved in the investigation. But police agencies do not operate like a single mind. Different jurisdictions have different responsibilities. Different officers handle different pieces. Information has to move between people. Cases have to be coordinated. The larger the investigation becomes, the more difficult coordination can become. And when multiple young people are missing or dead, the amount of information can grow rapidly. Names, dates, locations, statements, reports, photographs, evidence, possible suspects, possible witnesses. Every piece has to be recorded. Every connection has to be tested. And behind all of it is the knowledge that these are not theoretical cases. People are dead. Families are grieving. And if the offender is still free, someone else could become a victim. The summer of 1981, therefore, became a turning point. The pace of the killings made the investigation more urgent. 6 deaths in 1 month meant that whatever had been happening was no longer something investigators could treat as a series of isolated incidents. The possibility of a single offender became increasingly important. And as that possibility strengthened, so did the need to understand the person behind it. What kind of person could move through the community without immediately being identified? How did he select victims? How did he gain access to them? What did he tell them? Where did he take them? What happened afterward? These are the questions that define the behavioral side of an investigation, but they must be approached carefully. It is tempting to construct a psychological profile and then force every fact to fit it. Good investigation works differently. Behavioral patterns must emerge from evidence. Investigators have to look at what actually happened rather than what they expect to have happened. And this is where Olson's previous criminal history became significant. His past gave investigators a reason to examine him. But his past alone could not answer the central question. Was he the person responsible for the growing number of deaths? By August, the investigation would move dramatically closer to an answer. But before that answer came, the community had already lived through months of uncertainty. And the uncertainty had a cumulative effect. The first death shocks. The second creates concern. The third raises questions. By the time the killings accelerated in July, fear could no longer be separated from the investigation. Yet fear is not evidence. That distinction is critical. Investigators could not arrest someone simply because the public was frightened. They needed a case. They needed facts. They needed connections. And they needed something that would stand up in court. That is why the eventual arrest of Olson was so significant. It did not happen because investigators suddenly discovered a single magical clue. It came after a process of attention, suspicion, investigation, and accumulating information. On August 12, 1981, Olson was arrested following an incident involving his attempt to approach two female hitchhikers. The arrest would soon become a doorway into something much larger. He would be connected to the death of Judy Kozma, and then he would begin providing information about the other killings. For investigators, the geography of the case was about to change again. The places where the victims had been left would become critical. The locations were no longer simply unknown points in a search. Olson could identify them, and that meant the landscape itself could begin to reveal what had happened. The investigation could move from questions to physical recovery, from missing to found, from uncertainty to evidence. But it came at a price. The $100,000 arrangement would become one of the most controversial decisions associated with the case. It would also expose something about the relationship between geography and power. Olson knew where the bodies were. The investigators did not. That gave him leverage. The locations became bargaining tools. And suddenly, the landscape of British Columbia was not just the setting for the crimes. It became part of the negotiation. A place where a victim had been left could now be identified by the person accused of killing them. A family could receive an answer. Investigators could recover evidence. And Olson could gain something in return. This is the point where the setting becomes inseparable from the offender's manipulation. A location is usually passive. A field is a field. A road is a road. A piece of land is simply there. But in a criminal investigation, location can become power. Knowing where something is can be as valuable as knowing what happened. Olson possessed that knowledge. And for a time, he understood exactly how valuable it was. The investigators had to decide how to use that information. The public would later decide what it thought of the decision. History would preserve the controversy. But for the families, the most important thing was simpler. Where is my child? That question cuts through everything. Through politics. Through procedure. Through public opinion. Through the language of criminal justice. Where is my child? And if someone has the answer, what would you be willing to give to hear it? That question is at the center of the Olson case. It is also the question that transforms the landscape from background into evidence. Because every location associated with a victim carries a story. A place where someone was last seen. A place where evidence was recovered. A place where remains were discovered. A place where investigators searched. A place where a family eventually learned the truth. The geography of the case became a map of loss. But maps do not show grief. They show distance. They show roads. They show boundaries. They show locations. They do not show the silence inside a family's home after the police leave. They do not show the photograph held by a parent. They do not show the empty chair. They do not show the years that will pass. That is why we cannot tell this story only through locations. We have to understand the people who occupied them, the young lives that existed before the crime, the families who loved them, the routines that were interrupted, and the futures that disappeared. That will become the focus of the next part. Because before investigators can fully understand the offender, they must understand the victims. Before we study the man who took their lives, we must remember the lives that existed without him. And before the public knew the name Clifford Olson, there were 11 young people whose names meant something entirely different to the people who loved them. They were sons and daughters, friends, classmates, children, teenagers, young adults. They were not victims yet. They were simply living. And somewhere in the lower mainland, during a period that seemed ordinary to most of the world, their lives were moving toward an ending that nobody around them could see coming. That is the real setting of this story. Not darkness. Not a haunted landscape. Not a world that was obviously dangerous. A normal world. A world that looked safe enough to trust. And that is precisely what makes what happened so disturbing. Because evil rarely announces itself before it enters an ordinary day. It does not always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it moves quietly through familiar places. Sometimes it looks like another person. Sometimes it has a criminal record that people have already seen but do not yet understand. And sometimes, by the time the pattern becomes visible, lives have already been lost. By the end of the summer of 1981, the pattern surrounding Clifford Olson was becoming impossible to ignore. But the investigation still had to prove what the pattern meant. The police still had to establish connections. The victims still had to be identified and recovered. And the families still had to confront the truth. The lower mainland would eventually become a permanent part of the history of the case. But the map was never the real story. The real story was written in the names. Christine, Darren, Ada, Simon, Judy, Raymond, Sigrun, Terry, Louise, Sandra, and the others whose lives became connected to Olson's confession. The next step is to take those names out of the case file, to remove the numbers, to stop thinking of them as entries in an investigation, and to look at them as people. Because before the murders, there was life. And if this story is going to be told with any honesty, that life deserves to be remembered before we describe how it was taken away. Fear does not always arrive all at once. Sometimes it begins as a question. A child is late. A teenager does not come home. A telephone does not ring. A door remains closed. At first, there is an explanation. There is always an explanation. Maybe they are with a friend. Maybe they missed the bus. Maybe they decided to stay somewhere else. Maybe they forgot to call. Maybe they are angry. Maybe they simply need time. Families are accustomed to ordinary disruptions. People change plans. People make mistakes. Teenagers sometimes disappear for a few hours without understanding what those hours mean to the people waiting for them. That is why the first hours of a disappearance can be so difficult. The family is forced to make a judgment without enough information. Is this normal? Or is something wrong? The answer may determine how quickly the search begins. And when the person who is missing is young, every passing hour can become unbearable. The lower mainland was entering a period in which those questions would be asked repeatedly. Not by one family, by many. At first, each family experienced its own private uncertainty. The wider community could remain outside it. People could read about a missing person and feel sympathy without imagining that the same thing might happen to them. That psychological distance is natural. Most people do not wake up in the morning expecting to become part of a murder investigation. They expect ordinary problems. Work, school, bills, appointments, family arguments, dinner, sleep. The things that make up a normal life. But criminal cases have a way of destroying that sense of permanence. One disappearance can make people cautious. A second can make them nervous. A third can make them wonder whether the events are connected. And when the victims are young, the fear spreads differently. parents begin looking at their children differently. A teenager leaving the house can become a source of anxiety. A child being out later than expected can trigger a telephone call. A familiar stranger can suddenly seem unfamiliar. The world has not necessarily become more dangerous in every location, but people's perception of danger has changed. That distinction matters. Fear is not a map. Fear is a feeling. And feelings can spread faster than facts. In 1981, information did not move at the speed it does today. There were no social media feeds constantly refreshing with missing person alerts. No smartphones vibrating in pockets. No instant photographs shared across thousands of screens. Information traveled through newspapers, television, radio, telephone calls, police statements, and conversations between people. That meant that the public could know less than it knows today about an unfolding investigation. But it also meant that rumors could move through communities in their own way. One person heard something. Another repeated it. A third added a detail. By the time the story traveled far enough, nobody was certain where the original information had come from. For investigators, this created another problem. They needed the public's help. But they also needed accurate information. A witness could provide something important. A rumor could waste time. A photograph could help identify someone. A false assumption could send investigators in the wrong direction. The balance between public awareness and investigative secrecy was delicate. Police could not reveal everything they knew. Sometimes information must be withheld because releasing it could compromise an investigation. Sometimes investigators need to know whether a suspect reveals information that was never made public. Sometimes the public wants answers before police are ready to provide them. And in a case involving multiple young victims, that tension becomes especially intense. Families want information immediately. The public wants reassurance. Investigators need time. The media wants the story. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, evidence has to survive. That was the environment in which the Olson investigation developed. It was not simply a race to identify a killer. It was a race against uncertainty. The investigators had to build a picture from incomplete pieces. They needed to understand the victims. They needed to reconstruct their movements. They needed to determine when and where they had disappeared. They needed to identify connections. And they needed to ask whether someone was deliberately selecting young people. Those questions became more urgent as the number of victims increased. Christine Weller was 12. Darren Johnsrud was 16. Ada Court was 13. Simon Partington was 9. Judy Kozma was 14. Raymond King was 15. Sigrun Arndt was 18. Terry Carson was 15. Louise Chartrand was 17. Sandra Wolf Steiner was 16. The ages form a pattern that is impossible to ignore. Most were children or teenagers. One was 18. The victims were young enough that the adults around them still had an important role in their lives. Parents worried about where they were. Teachers knew their faces. Friends knew their personalities. Families knew their habits. When a young person disappeared, there were people who immediately noticed that something was wrong. That human network became important. A person does not disappear into a vacuum. Someone knows when they were last seen. Someone remembers what they were wearing. Someone remembers what they said. Someone remembers where they were supposed to be going. Someone knows whether they normally came home late. Someone knows whether they had recently been frightened. Someone may have seen them with another person. The smallest details can become important. But in the early stages of a disappearance, nobody knows which details matter. A family might remember a conversation that seemed ordinary. An investigator might later ask about it. A witness might remember a vehicle. Someone else might remember a face. A location might connect two otherwise unrelated stories. This is how investigations grow. Not through one dramatic revelation, but through hundreds of small pieces. And some of those pieces remain invisible until the larger picture emerges. That was particularly true in the Olson case. The full pattern was not obvious at the beginning. The deaths occurred over many months. The victims were individuals with their own lives. The investigations had to be conducted one at a time. Only later could the cases be placed side by side. And once they were, the similarities became increasingly disturbing. The summer of 1981 accelerated everything. 6 killings attributed to Olson occurred during July alone. That means that for investigators, the distance between one tragedy and the next was shrinking. The investigation could not simply proceed at a comfortable pace. The urgency was growing. And with urgency comes pressure. Pressure can sharpen an investigation. It can also create danger. When investigators know that another victim may be at risk, they have to move quickly. But moving quickly means making decisions with incomplete information. Every suspect must be evaluated. Every lead must be pursued according to its credibility. Every connection must be tested. The challenge is to move fast without becoming careless. That is one of the hardest balances in criminal investigation. And the pressure was not only coming from the possibility of another killing. It was also coming from the families. Families do not experience an investigation as an abstract process. They do not care how many files are on a detective's desk. They care about one person, their child, their brother, their sister, their friend. They want to know what happened. They want to know where that person is. They want someone to be held responsible. And when there is no answer, every delay feels personal. The police may say that they are working around the clock. The family may understand that. But understanding does not make waiting easier. The waiting itself becomes part of the trauma. A telephone rings. Everyone looks up. Maybe it is the police. Maybe it is a friend. Maybe it is nothing. A car slows outside. Someone looks toward the window. Maybe they have come back. Maybe this is the moment. And then the world remains unchanged. The absence continues. That psychological experience is one of the most devastating aspects of a missing person case. Hope can become exhausting. But surrendering hope can feel like betrayal. Families can become trapped between the two. The Olson investigation eventually brought some of those families the answer they had been waiting for. But the answer was not the one anyone wanted. Their children had not simply disappeared. They had been killed. And the man who knew where some of them were had his own demands. This is where the setting of the case becomes inseparable from its moral conflict. Imagine being an investigator with a suspected killer in custody. You believe he may know where several victims are. You need him to talk. He agrees to provide information. But he wants something in return. Money. Not for himself directly. For his wife and children. 100,000 Canadian dollars. The arrangement became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. It is difficult to imagine a more emotionally charged negotiation. Because the investigators were not negotiating over property. They were not bargaining over stolen goods. They were negotiating over the locations of dead children and teenagers. And Olson knew that. That is what makes the situation psychologically disturbing. A person's death had not ended their usefulness to the person accused of killing them. The victim's location still had value. The information could still be exchanged. The family could still be made to wait. The investigation could still be influenced. The dead had become part of the bargaining process. And the authorities had to decide whether recovering them justified the price. The public reaction would later demonstrate just how difficult that decision was to accept. But it is important to distinguish between understanding why the authorities made a decision and approving of it. Those are not the same thing. Investigators may have believed the information was necessary. Families may have desperately needed the bodies recovered. The authorities may have considered the arrangement the most effective way to obtain cooperation. And the public could still condemn the idea of providing a financial benefit to the family of an accused serial killer. Multiple truths can exist at the same time. That complexity is important. True crime stories often become simpler when told after the fact. We know the ending. We know who the killer was. We know who the victims were. We know the controversial decisions. But investigators did not know the ending. They were making choices inside the uncertainty. And every choice had consequences. The decision to negotiate would become part of the history of the case. The decision to accept Olson's information would help investigators locate victims. The decision to pursue a guilty plea would bring the legal process toward a conclusion. But none of those decisions could change what had already happened. That is another important part of the setting. The justice system operates after the crime. It can respond. It can investigate. It can prosecute. It can punish. But it cannot return the victim to the family. The most important moment in a murder case is therefore always the moment before the crime. Before the person disappears. Before the phone call is missed. Before the door closes. Before the family realizes that something is wrong. That is the moment when prevention is still possible. Once the crime happens, every institution is working backward, trying to reconstruct what was lost, trying to understand what happened, trying to identify who did it, trying to make sure it does not happen again. The Olson case would eventually raise uncomfortable questions about whether more could have been done before the murders. His criminal history was already known. He had already encountered the justice system. He was not an invisible person. That fact would inevitably influence how people later looked at the case. Could warning signs have been recognized differently? Could he have been identified sooner? Could any of the later killings have been prevented? These questions are easier to ask after the outcome is known. They are much harder to answer honestly. Hindsight has a powerful ability to make uncertainty disappear. Once we know what someone eventually did, earlier behavior can look like a warning sign. But investigators at the time did not know the future. A criminal record can contain disturbing behavior without predicting a specific future crime. A person can have committed one kind of offense without necessarily committing another. That does not mean warning signs should be ignored. It means that responsible analysis must distinguish between what was knowable then and what became obvious later. The Olson case sits directly in that uncomfortable space. His past mattered. But his past was not the same thing as proof. The investigation had to build a connection between Olson and the murders. And eventually, that connection became overwhelming. But before the arrest and confession, the community had already experienced months of uncertainty. That uncertainty had a physical geography. It existed in homes where people waited. It existed in police stations where reports accumulated. It existed in newspapers where photographs and names appeared. It existed in schools where classmates wondered what had happened. It existed in neighborhoods where parents watched their children more carefully. Fear changes the way people look at familiar places. A road that once meant convenience can begin to mean risk. A place where young people gather can become a subject of concern. An ordinary encounter can be replayed afterward. Did anyone notice something? Did anyone remember that person? Did anyone see the victim? Did anyone see a vehicle? Did anyone hear anything? The mind begins searching backward. It tries to turn ordinary moments into clues. That is a natural human response to catastrophe. We want to believe that terrible events leave obvious warnings. If we can find the warning, perhaps we can understand the tragedy. Perhaps we can believe it could have been prevented. But sometimes there is no single moment that explains everything. There are only fragments. The victims had lives before they became victims. The offender had a history before he became the central figure in a serial murder investigation. The investigators had information before they understood how significant it was. The public had fear before it had certainty. And the families had hope before they had answers. All of these realities existed simultaneously. That is what the setting looked like. Not a horror movie landscape. Not a place permanently covered in darkness. A normal community carrying an abnormal secret. That contrast is what makes the case so unsettling. The world did not look different. People did. They became more cautious, more suspicious, more aware. And for some families, their relationship with ordinary life would never recover. The victims' names became part of a case file. But their families continued to live after the cameras disappeared. They continued to celebrate birthdays. They continued to remember anniversaries. They continued to carry photographs. They continued to speak names. That is the part of true crime that is often missing from the final chapter. The offender receives a sentence. The headlines move on. The prison years pass. The case becomes history. But grief does not follow the same timetable. Grief does not end because the investigation ends. For the families, the investigation is only one phase. The rest of life still has to be lived. That makes the recovery of the victims especially important. A missing person exists in uncertainty. A recovered victim exists in grief. Those are different forms of suffering. But the second, however devastating, at least gives the family something concrete. A place to mourn. A place to remember. A confirmed truth. That was part of what the Olson investigation eventually provided. And it was also why his knowledge became so valuable. The authorities needed to know where the victims were. Olson knew. He could lead them to the answers. But he wanted something in return. That exchange became a defining feature of the case. It also exposed the disturbing degree to which Olson appeared to understand the power of his own information. He was no longer simply a suspect waiting passively for the justice system to act. He was participating in the investigation, controlling what he revealed, using information as leverage, and forcing authorities to make choices. That behavior would become central to the way many people understood him. The killer was not only accused of violence, he was also capable of manipulation. The two characteristics reinforced each other. Violence created the need for information. Information created leverage. Leverage created negotiation. And negotiation created controversy. That sequence would become part of the Olsen legacy. But the investigation still had another task. It had to establish exactly who the victims were. It had to reconstruct their final known movements. It had to understand their lives. And that is where the story must slow down. Because numbers are efficient. Names are not. A number can be spoken in a second. A person's life cannot. A name like 12-year-old victim tells us almost nothing. It tells us age. It tells us tragedy. But it does not tell us personality. It does not tell us dreams. It does not tell us family relationships. It does not tell us what made that person laugh. It does not tell us what they were afraid of. It does not tell us what they wanted to become. Those details are the difference between a victim and a human being in the way a story is told. And the responsibility of telling a true crime story is to resist turning people into statistics. The 11 victims connected to Olsen deserve to exist in the narrative as people who had lives before the murders. Their names should not be remembered only because of the man who killed them. They should be remembered because they existed. That is why the next chapter moves away from the geography of fear and toward the people who lived inside it. Before the investigation knew them as victims, they were children and teenagers growing up in a world that seemed ordinary. They had families. They had friends. They had routines. They had futures. And then, one by one, those futures were taken away. Christine Weller was 12 when her life ended. Darren Johnsrud was 16. Ada Court was 13. Simon Partington was 9. Judy Kozma was 14. Raymond King was 15. Sigrun Arndt was 18. Terry Carson was 15. Louise Chartrand was 17. Sandra Wolf-Steiner was 16. And the 11th victim remained part of the story through Olsen's confession. Each name represents a door into another human life. And each life deserves more than a sentence in a timeline. So as we leave the setting behind, we should remember what that setting really was. It was not simply British Columbia. It was not simply the Lower Mainland. It was not simply Richmond or a collection of locations connected by an investigation. It was home. It was school. It was family. It was childhood. It was adolescence. It was the ordinary world before the extraordinary violence became visible. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth about the entire case. The victims did not live in a world that looked like a crime story. They lived in a world that looked like ours. They woke up believing there would be another day. They made plans without knowing those plans would never happen. Their families expected them to grow older. And then suddenly they did not. That is the point at which a setting becomes a story. The streets become connected to names. The dates become connected to faces. The investigation becomes connected to families. And the case becomes more than a record of crimes. It becomes a record of what was lost. The summer of 1981 would eventually end. The investigation would continue. Clifford Olsen would be arrested. The bodies would be located. The confession would come. The courtroom would follow. But before any of that, there were lives. And those lives are where we need to go next. Because the best way to understand the horror of what happened is not to begin with the killer's darkness. It is to begin with the light that existed before it. The ordinary mornings. The familiar faces. The plans. The friendships. The families. The small details that make a person recognizable to the people who love them. Those are the details that disappear when a victim becomes a statistic. And those are precisely the details we need to recover. Not because they will change the outcome. They will not. But because remembering someone as a complete human being is one small way of refusing to let the person who killed them become the most important part of their story. Clifford Olsen would eventually become a name known across Canada. But the victims were here first. Their lives came first. Their families came first. And before we examine how those lives ended, we need to remember